I never thought I would be in this position, sitting in my living room, reflecting on something that, at the time, seemed so small, but in retrospect, changed everything. I never imagined that a simple gesture from someone I hardly knew would open the door to a new chapter in my life. But here I am, telling you this story because it's a reminder. Sometimes, the most unexpected acts are the ones that have the power to reshape our world. It all started one Thursday afternoon, just like any other. I had been feeling off for a while, but it wasn't something I was ready to admit, not even to myself. The years of constant busyness had caught up with me, and now at 58, I found myself quietly slipping into a space where everything felt heavy. The exhaustion was more than physical. It was emotional, too. It was like I had spent years giving, smiling, and pretending everything was fine, only to find that I had forgotten how to take care of myself. My world had gotten smaller, and I hadn't even realized it. My days were mostly the same, routine and empty. My neighbors, familiar faces for over a decade, hardly noticed anymore, and I didn't really expect them to. I was sitting at my window that day, watching the leaves in the yard fluttering in the wind. I was tired, so much more than I cared to admit. My joints ached, my mind felt foggy, and all I could do was stare at the world, feeling a strange disconnect from it. The thought crossed my mind that I hadn't been outside in days, maybe even a week. I told myself it didn't matter. After all, who was there to see me? Who was there to care? Then came the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated for a moment before slowly getting up to answer the door. It was a warm afternoon, and the air felt thick with stillness. As I opened the door, there stood Ben, my neighbor from next door. He was holding a small bag in his hands, his usually reserved expression softened by a quiet smile. "Hey, Martha," he said, and I almost didn't recognize the warmth in his voice. "I thought I'd bring you something. I know you've been feeling a bit under the weather lately." Ben, the quiet, distant man I'd exchanged the occasional greeting with. We'd never been close. In fact, I couldn't even remember the last time we'd spoken, outside of hello and good morning. But there he was, standing on my doorstep, looking at me with a sincerity that caught me off guard. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of surprise. How did he know? How had he noticed? "Thank you, but you really didn't have to," I said, though my voice wavered slightly. I couldn't help it. There was something in his gesture that felt both foreign and comforting. "I figured you could use something," he said simply. "It's just some homemade soup, nothing special, but I thought it might help. You've been quiet lately." His words were casual, but they cut deeper than I expected. I'd been quiet, yes, too quiet. The lump in my throat was growing. What did he mean by quiet? Did he notice something in me that I hadn't even seen? I stood there for a moment, holding the bag of soup in my hands. Ben's words lingered in the air between us, almost as though I had to breathe them in before I could say anything else. It was a strange sensation, this simple act of kindness from someone I barely knew. Yet it felt like more than just soup. It was something deeper, something I hadn't realized I needed until that very moment. "Thank you, Ben," I finally managed to say. My voice was quieter than I intended, but there was something in it now that hadn't been there before. Vulnerability, maybe. It wasn't easy for me to admit that I was struggling, but there it was, this quiet acknowledgement that I couldn't carry it all alone anymore. Ben nodded, and for a second, he just stood there, looking at me in that way that made me feel seen. It was as if he had caught a glimpse of something behind the walls I had built around myself. His eyes softened, and without another word, he turned to leave. But before he walked away, he looked back at me with that same quiet intensity. "If you need anything, Martha," he said, his voice low but steady, "I'm just next door. Don't hesitate." And just like that, he was gone. I closed the door behind me, still holding the bag of soup. I didn't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to the window just yet. The weight of what had just happened felt like a shift inside me, something small but unmistakable. I set the bag down on the kitchen counter, almost as though the act of placing it there somehow made it real. The soup wasn't anything extravagant, just simple homemade chicken broth with some vegetables. But for some reason, it felt like a lifeline. I hadn't cooked much lately. Honestly, the thought of food had lost its appeal. But Ben's gesture had sparked something in me, something I hadn't even known was missing. I had been so lost in my own isolation that I hadn't realized how much I longed for someone to notice, to care. I sat down at the table, staring at the bag for a few moments longer. I wasn't sure why it hit me so hard. Maybe it was because it wasn't just about the soup. It was about the fact that someone had seen me, really seen me. It had been years since I felt like I mattered to anyone. And Ben, this quiet man I barely knew, had managed to break through the walls I had spent so much time building. I opened the bag and started to heat the soup. As it warmed on the stove, I found myself thinking back to everything that had led me here. The years I had spent focused on everyone else, forgetting to take care of myself. The gradual slip into loneliness that I had convinced myself was fine, even necessary. The silent excuses I had made to explain why I pulled away from my family, my friends, and even the world around me. A soup began to bubble, the aroma filling the kitchen, and with it, a sense of peace I hadn't felt in so long. It wasn't just the warmth of the food. It was the realization that I wasn't invisible. Ben had shown me that. His simple act of kindness had cracked open a door I didn't even realize was closed. And as I sat there, waiting for the soup to finish cooking, I couldn't help but wonder, what else had I been missing out on? The knock at the door had been the beginning. I didn't know it then, but my life was about to change in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a chance to rediscover something I thought I had lost. The next few days passed by in a quiet blur. I'd like to tell you that I jumped right back into life after Ben's unexpected visit, but that's not how it went. Instead, I spent my time in reflection, slowly starting to come to terms with the things I had been avoiding for so long. Ben's kindness stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how someone who didn't owe me anything had cared enough to reach out. Each day, I found myself going through the motions, but something had shifted. The walls I had built around myself, though still present, felt a little weaker. I had begun to take small steps, allowing myself to open up again, just a little. The fatigue, which had once felt all-consuming, wasn't as overwhelming. It didn't magically disappear, but the heaviness in my chest seemed lighter. I began to go outside more, to breathe in the fresh air. Even if it was just for a few minutes, it was a small act of defiance against the inertia I had succumbed to for far too long. Ben and I continued our quiet exchanges, casual waves when we crossed paths, or brief conversations about the weather. Nothing big, nothing that would raise any eyebrows. But every time I saw him, I felt something stir inside me, a flicker of connection. There was something different in the air between us now. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was undeniable. And then, a few days later, it happened again. I was sitting in my usual spot by the window, nursing a cup of tea, when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching my front door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I knew exactly who it was before I even opened it. It was Ben. "Hi, Martha," he greeted me, his usual quiet demeanor softened by a hint of warmth. This time, he wasn't holding a bag of soup or groceries, but instead a small basket, the kind you might take to the market. "I thought you might like something fresh," he said, his voice as steady and sincere as it had been the first time. I went to the market and picked up some fruit. Apples, pears, peaches. "I thought you might enjoy it." I blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. I had just begun to process the impact of the soup, and now here he was again, offering me something else. Something small, but meaningful. "Thank you, Ben," I said, accepting the basket. My fingers brushed against his as I took it, and for a split second, I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the fruit. "You don't have to keep doing this," I added quickly, more out of habit than anything else. I didn't want to feel like I was becoming an obligation, a burden. But Ben just shrugged, a humble smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I know, but I want to. You've been a little quiet lately," he said, his eyes searching mine for a moment before he continued. "I figured you might need a little something to cheer you up." I smiled at him, unsure of how to respond. It was strange, this sense of being seen. Really seen in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be for years. I didn't know what to say, but I didn't need to. As I stood there holding the basket of fruit, something shifted in me. I had been so caught up in my own thoughts, in my own isolation, that I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone check in on me, even in the smallest of ways. Ben's kindness wasn't just an act of generosity. It was an invitation to reconnect with the world I had been hiding from for so long. Before I could say anything more, Ben's expression changed. His smile faded, and there was a new seriousness in his eyes. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if he were carefully choosing his next words. "Martha," he said, his voice lower now, "I don't mean to be nosy, but are you okay?" His words hit me like a wave, unexpected and blunt, yet laced with genuine concern. "I mean, really, how are you?" I stood there, frozen for a moment. It was as if someone had finally ripped off the Band-Aid I'd been trying to keep firmly in place. No one had asked me that in a long time. Not like this. Not with the kind of quiet sincerity that made it clear Ben wasn't just making small talk. I wasn't ready to answer. I wasn't sure I even knew how to respond. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of quiet urgency, a desire to understand, that made me realize, for the first time in a long while, that I didn't have to hide anymore. I didn't have to pretend everything was fine. Instead of answering right away, I did something that surprised even myself. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. Ben's face softened. "Sure," he said, stepping into the house. The small shift in his demeanor as he crossed the threshold unmistakable. We sat down at the kitchen table, and for a while, we talked about nothing important. The weather, our neighbors, the usual pleasantries. But underneath the small talk, I could feel the weight of his question still lingering in the air. His quiet presence gave me space to breathe, to not feel rushed or judged. After a few moments, I finally spoke. "I'm not okay," I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. "I haven't been for a while. It's not just the physical stuff. It's everything. The isolation, the way I've just faded into the background. I've been avoiding facing it, avoiding facing myself." Ben didn't say anything at first. He just listened, his eyes never leaving mine. His silence was comforting, not uncomfortable. I could tell he wasn't judging me. He was just there, letting me be honest with myself for the first time in a long time. "You don't have to go through it alone," Ben said, breaking the silence. His words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Sometimes just talking about it, even a little, can make all the difference. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't even sure how to feel. But for the first time in ages, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a dramatic change, not yet. But it was the beginning of something. Something real. Something that had been missing for so long. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Ben's quiet understanding had begun to fill the empty spaces inside me. And that was only the start. The days after that conversation with Ben felt different, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly how. The heaviness in my chest wasn't completely gone, but it had lessened. I found myself looking forward to the moments when I would see him, when our casual exchanges would turn into something a little more, something quietly significant. Ben's presence, though still understated, began to feel like an anchor. I had no expectation of anything more. I wasn't looking for anything to change, but every time we spoke, Even if it was just a brief chat across the yard, something shifted inside me. A sense of being seen, of being noticed, of mattering, even in the smallest ways. That's what Ben had given me, and for the first time in a long while, it made me feel like I wasn't invisible. A week had passed since he brought the fruit, and I was sitting by my window once again, gazing out at the garden. The flowers I had been neglecting were starting to bloom again. The sight of them, vibrant and full of life, brought a small smile to my lips. I hadn't tended to the garden much in the past few months. It had been one of those things I told myself I'd get to someday, but that day never came. Today, though, I felt different. The air seemed a little fresher, the world outside my window just a little brighter. I felt an urge to be outside, to reconnect with something real, something alive. So I put on my worn gloves, grabbed my gardening tools, and stepped outside into the sunshine. The physical effort felt good. And as I knelt by the flower beds, the soil cool against my hands, I realized how much I had missed this. There was something meditative about gardening. It gave me space to think, to reflect, and to simply be. I was so caught up in the quiet rhythm of it that I didn't notice the time passing. That's when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching my door. I knew without looking who it was. I didn't need to see his face to know it was Ben. I hesitated for only a moment before I stood up, wiping the dirt from my hands, and made my way to the front door. There he was, standing just a few steps away, holding something in his hand. This time, it wasn't soup or fruit. It was a small, simple package wrapped in brown paper. "Hi, Martha," Ben said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "I thought I'd bring you something. I'm not sure if you'll need it, but I thought it might help." I stared at the package for a moment before taking it from him. My fingers brushed against his as I did, and I couldn't help but notice the warmth in his touch. Something small, but it lingered in the air between us. "What is it?" I asked, curious, but also a little hesitant. There was something about the gesture, something about Ben's quiet generosity, that made me feel both grateful and exposed. "It's some tea," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I know you've been feeling under the weather lately. I thought you might like something warm to help you relax. It's just a few bags of chamomile and lavender, nothing fancy. I figured it might help calm you down a bit." I didn't know why, but the simple act of him thinking about me in such a way hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the tea, it was the care behind it. The fact that someone had noticed, had cared enough to do something small, yet meaningful. "Thank you, Ben," I said, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "You really didn't have to." He gave a small smile, his gaze softening. "I know, but I want to. You've been so quiet, Martha. If you need anything at all, just let me know." The words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them sinking in deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just about the tea. It wasn't even just about the soup or the fruit. It was about someone who was offering me something more. Someone who was offering his presence, his attention, without hesitation or expectation. "I'm fine," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I didn't want to feel like a burden, even though I knew, deep down, that Ben didn't see it that way. Ben didn't respond to my words. Instead, he simply nodded, his smile still there, but more gentle now. It was as though he understood something I hadn't yet fully acknowledged. "You know where to find me," he said, his voice quiet but full of sincerity. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, still holding the package of tea. I closed the door behind me, but I didn't immediately go back inside. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the garden again. The earth was warm beneath my feet, the sun still shining softly. But something inside me had changed in that moment. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I could feel it, the shift in the air, the quiet connection growing between Ben and me. I hadn't realized how much I had missed feeling connected to another person until now. And yet, with every small gesture from Ben, I found myself opening up, just a little more. I went back inside, placed the tea on the counter, and stood there for a moment. I wasn't sure what this was becoming or where it would lead. I wasn't looking for anything. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder. Could it be that after all these years, after so much loneliness, someone like Ben could help me rediscover parts of myself I had buried so long ago? The next few days unfolded quietly, as days often do when you're not expecting anything to change. But something inside me was different, whether I wanted to admit it or not. Ben's gestures, though small, were having an effect I couldn't quite explain. The way he checked in on me, the way he didn't push for more than I was willing to give, was slowly creating a shift in my world. I spent my days in the garden more than I had in years, tending to the flowers, watching as they began to bloom again. There was something therapeutic about it, something grounding. I didn't realize how disconnected I had become from simple joys like the feeling of soil between my fingers, the sight of green shoots pushing through the earth. But as I worked, I found myself thinking about Ben, about how his quiet acts of kindness had brought me back to myself in ways I never imagined. I hadn't expected anything from him. I didn't think I was ready for anything more than the occasional friendly chat. But with each passing day, I found myself looking forward to the moments when our paths would cross. A brief wave, a shared smile, an unspoken understanding that seemed to grow between us with each interaction. There was a quiet comfort in those moments, a sense of connection that felt new, even though it was subtle and unspoken. And then one evening, just as I was finishing my work in the garden, I saw Ben again. It was later than usual. The sky was a deep, dusky blue, and the air had begun to cool. I was wiping the dirt from my hands when I noticed him standing by his gate, looking over at me. For a moment, we just stood there, both of us silently observing each other, the distance between us filled with the soft hum of the evening. "Hi, Martha," he called, his voice gentle but clear in the quiet of the evening. "I've been meaning to ask you something." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over to the gate, a little curious but unsure of what he might say. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ben hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for dinner sometime. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal. I thought it might be nice to eat together." I blinked, surprised by the invitation. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was more than I had expected. Dinner? With Ben? It felt strange, the idea of sitting down with someone who had become such a quiet presence in my life. It wasn't like me to accept invitations from people I hardly knew, but for some reason, the idea of spending time with Ben didn't feel strange. It felt natural. I could feel my pulse quicken slightly, a mix of hesitation and curiosity running through me. I hadn't had dinner with anyone in ages, not in this way, not like this. I think that would be nice," I said, almost before I could think it through. The words felt right, though, in a way I couldn't fully explain. Ben smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Great. How about tomorrow evening? I'll keep it simple, just some pasta, maybe a salad. Nothing special, but it'll be good to sit down and talk." I nodded, still a little stunned. I had expected the routine, the quiet distance that had defined our interactions until now. But this felt different. It was a shift, a step into something new. "Tomorrow sounds good," I said, my voice steadier now. "I'll be there." "Looking forward to it," he said, his smile widening just slightly. "I'll keep it casual. See you then." As Ben turned to walk back to his house, I stood there for a moment, still processing the invitation. Dinner. It was such a simple thing, yet it felt like a significant step. I hadn't expected to share a meal with Ben of all people. But there it was, this small moment that had the power to change everything. I went back inside, my mind a little muddled, the quiet, unassuming way Ben had offered the invitation. It was as though he was asking me to share something simple, yet meaningful. He hadn't made it about anything grand or complicated. It was just an invitation to connect, to share time together. And for some reason, that felt like exactly what I needed. The evening passed slowly. I found myself preparing for tomorrow, not in any grand way, but simply by allowing myself to feel the anticipation. It was the first time in a long while that I had looked forward to something that wasn't part of the routine. It wasn't just the dinner, I realized. It was the idea of being seen, of being acknowledged, of reconnecting with someone. As the sun set and the evening settled in, I found myself sitting in my living room, reflecting on the strange path that had brought me here. Just a few weeks ago, I had been content to live in isolation, to stay in the background, letting the world pass me by. And now, here I was, thinking about dinner with my quiet, reserved neighbor. What had changed? Maybe it was his simple acts of kindness. Or maybe it was the way he had seen me, really seen me, when I had become so good at hiding. Whatever it was, I knew this was just the beginning. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the verge of rediscovering something important. Something I had forgotten existed. And tomorrow, I would sit down with Ben and share a meal. Maybe it would be just that, a meal. Or maybe, just maybe, it would be the start of something more. The next day felt different, charged with an energy I hadn't experienced in a long time. The evening ahead seemed small in comparison to everything I had been through, yet somehow it felt monumental. I couldn't shake the thought that this dinner was more than just a simple meal. For the first time in a while, I was excited about something. The quiet company of a neighbor, someone who had unexpectedly offered me kindness when I didn't even know I needed it. The hours leading up to dinner passed in a blur. I spent most of my day with restless thoughts swirling in my mind, and the closer it got to the time I was supposed to go over to Ben's house, the more the anticipation gnawed at me. I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like. What were we really doing? Was it just dinner, or was it something more? It wasn't like I'd been seeking companionship, but the thought of someone caring, of someone seeing me, was unsettling in a way I hadn't anticipated. But somehow it felt right. At precisely 6:30, I walked across the yard, feeling the soft evening air on my skin. The garden, which I'd been neglecting for months, looked so different now, the flowers blooming in the fading light. I felt a small sense of pride as I looked at them, as if they were a reflection of the shift that had occurred inside me. Maybe there was still hope for me to bloom too. When I reached Ben's front door, I hesitated for just a moment. I could hear the faint hum of music coming from inside, a soft melody, something instrumental. It was inviting, calm. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and knocked. Ben opened the door almost immediately, his smile warm and welcoming. "Hey, Martha," he greeted me, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm glad you could make it," I smiled back, feeling a bit nervous, but there was a comfort in his presence that eased some of my anxiety. "Thanks for inviting me," I said, entering the house. It felt cozy, modest, but full of warmth. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect for a quiet man like Ben, but there was something about it that felt genuine, like he had put thought into making his space comfortable and lived in. "I hope you're hungry," Ben said, gesturing toward the dining table, which was set simply but thoughtfully. There was pasta with a light tomato sauce, a small side salad, and a loaf of freshly baked bread. The table was lit by a couple of candles, their soft light flickering gently in the room. "It looks wonderful," I said, genuinely impressed. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly the kind of meal that felt personal, made with care. We sat down at the table, and I couldn't help but notice how comfortable the silence between us was. We weren't forcing conversation or trying to fill the space with trivial words. Instead, we just enjoyed the meal, the quiet presence of one another. It was so different from anything I had expected. I realized that in my previous interactions with people, I had always been so focused on making everything perfect, on saying the right things. But here, with Ben, there was no pressure. There was only the present moment, the simple act of sharing a meal together. "So how's the garden coming along?" Ben asked after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. I looked up from my plate, meeting his eyes. His question felt thoughtful, and I appreciated that he remembered. "It's coming along, slowly, but it's getting there," I replied. "I've been spending more time out there, trying to take care of it again. It feels good to be outside, to work with my hands." "I'm glad to hear that," Ben said, his voice warm. "It's important, I think, to find those small things that keep us grounded." His words hit me harder than I expected. They weren't just casual, they were genuine. In that moment, I realized how much I had been searching for something to ground me, something to pull me back from the isolation I had created. And here Ben was, offering me something I hadn't known I needed. A reminder that there were still small, simple joys to be had in the world. We talked more after that, about our lives, our families, the things we'd experienced. There were no dramatic confessions, no life-changing revelations. Just two people, sharing pieces of their stories, connecting over the little things. It was an ordinary evening, but there was something extraordinary about it, something that had slowly, quietly started to change my perspective. As the evening went on, I found myself relaxing into the conversation. I was no longer thinking about how I might be perceived or what I should say next. For the first time in ages, I felt free from the expectations I had placed on myself, free from the walls I had built around my heart. After dinner, Ben suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood. The night was cool, the stars scattered across the sky in their quiet brilliance. We walked side by side, the soft sound of our footsteps echoing in the silence. There was no rush, no agenda. We didn't have to say anything profound. We simply enjoyed the peace of the moment, the simplicity of being together. "I'm glad we did this," I said quietly as we walked, the words coming easily. I didn't realize how much I needed something like this. Ben glanced over at me, his expression soft. "Me too," he said, his voice gentle. "Sometimes it's the little things, you know? The things we least expect." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle into me. I had spent so much time thinking that life needed to be more exciting, more dramatic, more anything. But in that moment, walking beside Ben, I realized that the simple moments were the ones that mattered most. The quiet gestures, the shared silences, the small acts of kindness that had the power to change everything. We didn't say much more after that. The night stretched on, peaceful and still, as we walked in the calm of the evening. There was no rush to get anywhere. We were just two people in the quiet company of each other, learning what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, after so many years of hiding. The evening ended as quietly as it had begun, but it had shifted something inside me, something I hadn't expected. Maybe it was the dinner, maybe it was the walk, or maybe it was simply the fact that someone had cared enough to see me. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The days after dinner were quiet, but filled with a kind of anticipation I couldn't quite explain. Ben and I hadn't seen each other much, but it didn't feel like things had returned to the way they were before. There was a subtle shift in the air between us, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. The small moments we shared, the simple exchanges, felt more meaningful now. I couldn't stop thinking about the dinner, about the walk, about the way Ben had quietly reminded me that life wasn't just about the big, dramatic moments. It was about the small ones, the ones we often overlook. It was a week after our dinner when I found myself standing at the door to his house once again, this time with a plate of cookies I had baked earlier in the day. I wasn't sure why I was bringing them, other than the fact that I wanted to. Maybe it was a way to say thank you. Maybe it was a way to reciprocate the kindness he had shown me, the kindness that had started to slowly transform my life in ways I hadn't expected. When Ben opened the door, He seemed surprised to see me standing there, holding the plate of cookies. But then his expression softened into a smile, and he stepped aside to let me in. "Hey, Martha," he said, his voice gentle. "What's all this?" "I baked some cookies," I said, offering him the plate. "I figured I'd bring them over. You know, for everything." "You didn't have to," Ben said, looking at the plate for a moment before meeting my eyes. "But thank you. This is really kind of you." We stood there for a moment, neither of us saying much. It wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt right. The silence between us had become comfortable, familiar. I didn't need to say anything more. Just being there, in his house, in his presence, felt like enough. We sat down, and Ben poured us both a cup of tea. It wasn't a grand gesture. Just two people sitting together, sharing simple things. Conversation was light, casual. We talked about the weather, the neighborhood, the small things that had happened in our lives since we last spoke. But underneath the surface, there was something else, something that neither of us had fully acknowledged yet. It was there in the way we spoke, in the way we looked at each other. A subtle tension that had been building slowly, almost imperceptibly. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Ben said after a while, his voice quieter now. "About what's been happening between us, I guess. I didn't expect things to go this way, but I'm glad they did." I looked at him, my heart suddenly racing in my chest. "Me too," I said softly, the words coming easily. "I didn't know what to expect either, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm here." There was a long pause, and I could feel the weight of it hanging between us. Like a door slowly opening, Ben's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small touch, nothing too forward, but it sent a wave of warmth through me. For the first time in so long, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen, truly seen, in a way that was more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. "I don't know where this is going," Ben said, his voice gentle but earnest. "But I don't want it to stop. I don't want us to go back to the way things were." I felt a flutter in my chest, a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Neither do I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. We sat there for a while, not saying much, but knowing everything that needed to be said. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was filled with possibilities, quiet, subtle, but full of promise. As the evening wore on, we moved to the living room, sitting side by side in the dim light, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm glow around the room. I could hear the gentle sound of Ben's breathing, the rhythm of his presence beside me. It wasn't the kind of love story you read about in books. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. It was simple, real, and in its own way, beautiful. We weren't rushing toward anything. We were just being, and that, in itself, felt like everything. "I'm glad you came over," Ben said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't want you to feel like you have to go through this alone, Martha. Whatever happens next, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Those words, simple as they were, hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't about promises or expectations. It was about the quiet assurance that I wasn't alone anymore. That whatever came next, I wouldn't have to face it by myself. "I'm here too," I said, my voice steady now, the weight of everything we had shared settling into me. "And I'm ready. Ready for whatever comes next, with you." Ben nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Then let's see where it takes us." And in that moment, I knew that it didn't matter where we were going. What mattered was that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't alone. I didn't need the grand gestures, the promises of love that felt too heavy. All I needed was this, a quiet, steady connection, built on simple acts of kindness and the willingness to be seen. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it with Ben by my side. And that, I realized, was all I really needed. If you enjoyed the story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel and write to the bell, and share your impressions of listening to this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.